Give us the future. We have had enough of your past. Give us our country back. To live in. To grow in. To love in. Michael Collins. So last time we ended with the freedom of the Irish rebels in December of 1916. Although technically no large-scale fighting had occurred, the new IRB had been joined in strength with a political party by the name of Sinn Féin, a party which actually held seats in the Westminster Parliament of England. But behind the scenes, Sinn Féin was actually plotting the country's liberation. A shadow government was created of a Sinn Féin government. In the eyes of the Republicans, Ireland was an independent nation. Its government had been illegally executed by the foreign government. So the new, in quote, government was now formed in secrecy. The first president was a man named Cathal Brugha, a dedicated Republican, and was Eamon Kent's second-in-command during the Easter Rising. Brugha was responsible in 1919 for stepping down as president, giving it to Eamon de Valera at the first Dáil na hÉireann assembly election. The Dáil na hÉireann was pretty much the Irish Assembly. It actually still exists today as the lower house of the Irish legislature, but this was founded in spite of the seats they won in Westminster. But when creating this government, they needed something to defend it. So at the assembly, Cathal Brugha became the Secretary of Defense, and the Irish volunteers were reorganized into the new National Army, the Irish Republican Army. The only issue was many of members of this government were arrested soon after its foundation. One of the only people not arrested was the Minister of Finance, Michael Collins. Collins had become somewhat of a rogue in the structure of this government. He quickly, in one night, not only became the head of the only free member, the head of the only of the government because he was the only free member of the government, but also the de facto commander of the Irish Republican Army. Collins had recognized the failure of 1916, the idea of marching in columns towards slaughter, as he would later say. He himself was Joseph Plunkett's aide-de-camp during the Rising, so he had studied other nations, including the United States. Deciding the IRA would only have success in stealth and speed, so instead of regiments, the IRA was organized into what became known as flying columns. Each county force would have one job: strike the British and Royal Irish Constabulary units, then disappear back into the moors and hills of Ireland. In the cities, though, Collins took an even more, in quote, modern tactic. Copying the American mobsters, in Dublin he created his infamous 12 Apostles. 12 men he trusted more than anything and would carry out assassinations for him. For some time they actually did damage to the British infrastructure, taking out supplies and RIC barracks, but more importantly, took out RIC detectives. In London, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, had become furious. Especially under his direction, many of these individuals were freed. So he sent 2 military groups and a detective organization to Ireland. The military groups are infamous to this day in Ireland, and that would be the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. These were units made up of primarily Great War veterans who saw it as an easy job to be shipped across the Irish Sea to be, in a words, a glorified police officer. But the detectives and military used them brutally to punish the people of Ireland who, as we said in the last video, had been turning on the English. Incidents of murder, unjustified executions, imprisonment, and most heinous rape of women and children would occur through the 2 years of the War of Independence from 1921 to 1922. But the detectives were named the Cairo Gang, were sent to actually find Collins and his spy network. Now, Collins had become the leader of the efforts. He was the one talked about by the regular people. He was the hero of the Irish and the terror to the British. One of the biggest issues facing the Cairo Gang was the fact no one in the British administration actually knew what Michael Collins looked like. He had done everything in his power to be sure no one knew what he looked like, so no one connected him to loved ones or friends. He would live on the run, jumping safe house to safe house. Sometimes he would actually walk up to the detectives in public, they unaware whom they were talking to. Now, De Valera had actually broken out of prison and went to America in order to raise funds and support for the Irish Republic, and officially left the command of the war in the hands of Michael Collins, which was seriously about to escalate. Now, the Cairo gang was getting very close to finding out who Collins was, and also his entire network. Now, earlier in the war, it was easy to find the RIC detectives and neutralize them, but the Cairo gang was a little more clever. They would, like Collins, move carefully, be sure they weren't leaving Dublin Castle where people could see them, and shrouding themselves in mystery. Collins, though, through his own spies, was able to find a list of where all the men would be. On November 21st, 1920, the 12 apostles and other IRA men were sent out to take out all members of the detective group. All members of the Cairo gang would be killed, along with one RIC officer, 2 auxiliaries, and 2 civilians connected to the dead detectives. This threw Dublin Castle into a state of chaos and rage. The administration, tired of Collins and his antics, gave an order, which would sadly become common tool in the British handbook. At the Gaelic football stadium of Croke Park, Dublin was playing Tipperary the afternoon of the 21st. As the game continued on, black and tans with auxiliaries began to seal the entrances in and out of the park, then scaled the walls, taking up firing positions. A British biplane would fly over the park, everyone seeing it, and would suddenly drop a red flare into the park. The British began to open fire on the innocent civilians, killing 14 and injuring 80. Also in County Cork, Collins' home county, also known as the Rebel County, they had been suffering reprisals from specifically the auxiliaries for the actions of what became known as Bloody Sunday. The West Cork Brigade, or better known as Barry's Column, commanded by a man named Tom Barry, on November 28th, a week following the massacre at Dublin, made a plan. Barry dressed as an auxiliary officer, which was actually just a volunteer's tunic, and flagged 2 auxiliary lorries to pull over to help him. Once they both did, Barry threw a grenade, and from the hills, the IRA opened fire on the lorries and their drivers. Beaming grenades at the frightened auxiliaries, only one of them would get away unharmed. 16 were dead and 1 wounded, while only 3 IRA were killed in Barry's column. The Kill Michael ambush, as it became known, was the most common strategy of fighting for the IRA. And Cork soon became a death sentence for the British police or soldiers, but De Valera returned to Ireland and convened his government, and he had become, in short of words, furious at the actions of the IRA. Again, he is the president of Ireland. He is the commander-in-chief of the IRA. The reality was their guerrilla war was brutal, and the English press compared them to assassins and gangsters. Which, his rage wasn't wrong. Like, he had just spent over a year in the United States lobbying for recognition of Ireland as a free nation. But his military was behaving as terrorists. So he commanded that a full-out engagement must begin, that the IRA must be viewed as a legitimate military force and not hide in the shadows. Collins was, of course, opposed to this. He also made the point that it was the guerrilla tactics that was winning the war. But the majority of the cabinet agreed with De Valera and didn't want to be viewed as assassins and gangsters. So, as a show of force, Collins was ordered by De Valera and Cathal Brugh to attack the Customs House in Dublin. The assault on the building began on May 25th, 1921, setting it ablaze, showing a propaganda victory. the IRA came out in force and showed themselves as true soldiers, not cutthroats. But militarily, the attack was made by 120 IRA. Only 35 returned, and 3 of those were wounded. Collins was, of course, furious at this outcome. He placed blame entirely on De Valera and Brewer, who he believed allowed their righteous egos to risk the limited number of soldiers that they had. Fighting would continue, and it would become a stalemate. The IRA would kill English soldiers, then the British would retaliate by abusing the civilian population. Many in the IRA high command, including Michael Collins, believed they would not be able to break the stalemate unless they were to bring the war to English soil. So some plans were being made to send IRA to places like London, York, and Liverpool and begin campaigning there. But in England, the British government was becoming strained. The Conservatives were being constantly ridiculed by the Liberals, who were criticizing the actions of the British government in Ireland. And it really did not help Lloyd George and his government when King George V actually spoke out against the British military tactics in Ireland and what the Black and Tans and auxiliaries had been doing. The only person who was pro-continuing the conflict was Winston Churchill, who earlier in the year had become the colonial secretary and was as pure a Victorian imperialist as they were. But pressure from all sides became too much, and finally Lloyd George called for a truce and extended an olive branch to De Valera and Sinn Féin for a truce, and to enter negotiations in July of 1921. In Dublin, people rejoiced by going to the Mansion House, which had been serving as the headquarters for the provisional government, to celebrate. But De Valera now had the exhausting job of setting up a group of representatives to go to England to negotiate. He picked 5 men. The first was Arthur Griffith, who actually was the founder of Sinn Féin, but was De Valera's Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Robert Barton, the Secretary of Economic Affairs, along with 2 regular members of the Dáil na hÉireann, Eamon Duggan and George Duffy. And shockingly, his final choice was none other than Michael Collins, his Secretary of Finance, and the man who was being declared the man who won the war. Now, our next episodes are 2 of the most controversial subjects in the nation of Ireland, and it will be on the peace treaty and the Irish Civil War. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed what you watched, please like and share. Spread the history. Also, if you have any facts or things you don't think were covered, please comment. Also, if we're new, please join us and hit that red subscribe button and join this growing community. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.